Welcome to the futureprint podcast, celebrating print technology and the people behind it.
Welcome to the futureprint podcast. Really happy to have with me for this edition, Mr. Finn Carston, who has a very interesting business called Knowledge Brief, which we'll find more out about as we go through this discussion. And we're going to be talking a lot around sort of trends, with a particular focus in this discussion, I think, around sort of the kind of importance and significance of AI. And Finn's business and his experience isn't from the printing industry, and I think that's refreshing. We need to hear more of this kind of content. So welcome to the podcast, Finn.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
No, that's brilliant. And I'm really interested to hear what you have to say for the next sort of few minutes or 20 minutes or so. Because obviously we're not shackled really by sort of schedules like you are with events and so on. So we can talk as long or as little as we like really with the podcast, which is super. So Finn, Knowledge Brief, fascinating sounding business. Like I said, you're going to explain a bit more about that. But tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background.
Yes. So I've kind of like through like university, kind of like school, and up until this point, I've done a lot of kind of like research work. So my degree was kind of like in kind of like anthropology, so kind of like social research. And I've done like various kind of like freelance researching for people. And then I kind of took a slightly different route and went into sales for a couple of years. And then I thought, how about like, why don't I try and combine the skills that I learned from sales and kind of go back to my passion for kind of like research and kind of explaining kind of complex topics. And I guess the thing that I'm kind of most interested in is, one of the things I'm most interested in is the sort of relationship between humans and technology, and the kind of trying to explain the kind of societal and economic and occasionally kind of like ethical implications of certain technologies and innovations. And I think, right now that's kind of needed more than ever in this world that we're living in.
And is it like you say, humans and technology? The impact of technology on society is huge, isn't it? And I guess the pace of change and the volatility we have now, we're all looking for ways to understand and fathom it. And I really like the name of the business, Knowledge Brief, in that I guess part of, I don't know if I'm right in assuming this, but part of the value you're offering is that you're able to demystify and declutter things and give people sort of insight that isn't encyclopedic, but it's thought through already. So you're really distilling down the basics. So tell us a bit about Knowledge Brief. What kind of problem it's solving, and what value the business or the kind of business or the offering will provide.
Yeah. So I think a lot of discussions around I guess AI and other innovations sort of tend to descend into kind of, oh, this is going to be the end of the world, or oh, this is going to save us. And I think neither of which are very useful for anybody. And I think the thing that I've kind of, I guess, noticed and sort of that's fascinated me is that there's so much kind of context on sort of how it's going to impact, like certain nations, certain industries, like specifically. I think people would much rather sort of engage with than the stories of like the super intelligence is gonna wipe us all out, or this is going to be the singularity where we merge kind of perfectly with like AIs. I think ultimately the stuff on the sort of the ground and how is it going to affect us in the kind of present moment, that's what that's kind of the problem that I'm trying to solve. And in terms of the medium that I use, so I'm mostly on YouTube, although I also use Substack as well. Looking into the long term, these sorts of innovations are going to affect young people the most. So, and for the most part, there's still very good journalism happening on, for example, like radio or
Mm.
newspapers, magazines. But the reality is, young people aren't really listening to the radio,
Mm.
and there's quite good like statistics to back that up. I think in the US, I looked at a kind of Pew Research Center poll, and something like 30% of people under 30 get their news from TikTok and YouTube.
Mm.
So, and for the most part, YouTube's been thought of as kind of like, well, they won't now because TikTok's just been banned in the US, but
Mm.
but yeah, it's they've just they've basically asked the US has basically said to China it needs to become a like a US company so they can sort of control their own data. Otherwise, it's going to be banned. But
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
that's a story worth following. I think I've got that right. I hope I got that right.
Mm. Mm.
um, but but yeah, so I think there's sort of, YouTube has typically been thought of as for like kind of like entertainment, but I think it's going to be the way in which a lot of people sort of come to like understand what's going on. So I think there has to be sort of credible like sort of video media sources that people can go to
Mm.
that aren't just I guess for entertainment, but also to try and make sense of the world. So yeah.
Yeah, and also it's interesting that like the YouTube is a great example of where it's sort of permitting anybody to broadcast and anybody to express an opinion and anybody who's got internet connection to provide some insight. And I think there is a bit of pushback against some of the big media companies because they've all got agendas, haven't they? They've all got specific political alliances. There's a level of control over what they report, how they report it, and so on. So I think that's interesting. And obviously, we're on a podcast. I get a lot of my insight from podcasts. So I won't listen to certain media because of its agenda. So it's an interesting point. And also some of the things that are happening, sort of leading a bit onto more sort of AI, as we talked a little bit before about this, and you sort of in terms of media and reporting and so on, the kind of deep fake technology that's being used to influence people's opinion via technology platforms and so on. That's partly, moving on to AI is that something I think you've looked at as well in terms of the impact of AI on democracy, on how people form opinions, where they get their information from, whether it's true, whether it's valid, or whether it's manipulated and cynical. That's a big deal, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so, because I think fundamentally, some people might disagree with this, but I think democracies rely quite heavily on information quality, being able to get the right sort of quality information at the kind of the sort of public level, so that we can kind of make better decisions at the political level. I think that's like a kind of like fundamental of democracy, is using the kind of wisdom of people to make decisions at the political level.
Mm.
And so I think there's definitely the opportunity for bad actors to use generative AI and sort of deepfake technology to kind of I guess make the sort of information ecosystem trusted less. And
Mm.
you can kind of, I think in the worst case scenario, you can kind of envision a world where, no one really trusts what they see on the internet because they've seen so many deep fakes. So there's so many like
Mm.
news stories about deep fakes that are like, well, how do I know this isn't a deep fake? And I think that can work into the hands. We've already seen, for example, with social media, and like, for example, like Russia's interference in elections,
Mm.
through like social media bots and stuff. So that's been happening since like that's been happening probably forever in some variety. But yeah, um, but at the same time, I think there are some kind of fairly simple, not simple, but there are solutions to these sorts of problems, like being able to watermark content to know whether it's AI or not. And that's actually the EU AI Act, which was passed yesterday. Yesterday, I think it was. It's not in law yet, but it was passed yesterday. And one of its sort of one of the tenets of it is they like generative AI companies basically have to create watermarks so that people know whether it's generated content or not. And I think there's sort of been some discussion around, people that have created AI to take the watermarks off and stuff like that. So it's a little bit kind of, yeah. But yeah, so
But it just goes to underline, doesn't it, the speed to which AI suddenly become accessible for everyone.
Yeah.
And anybody can tinker with it via this platform, OpenAI. And I know there's lots of other platforms that are possibly more sophisticated and so on, but you can create graphics, you can do a lot with it just by asking it to do what you want, and it's incredible. So all of a sudden it seems like this massive acceleration within, like you said, the EU. I think the US has already passed law a lot around AI as well. So it's kind of very much on the radar. Give us your view of what AI means really, or could mean perhaps to the print sector, and how it's likely to develop on a macro level, and even actually how would you even define AI?
Yeah, so I think because of its kind of like complexity as a technology, it doesn't kind of just fall into one kind of single definition. So I think there's a few kind of ways, there's a few sort of general points I'd make about AI in terms of like a definition. The first thing I'd say is it's a system that aims to mimic human sort of like cognitive functions. And I would also, another kind of way of thinking about it is that it's machine or machines that attempt to kind of perform tasks that require, I guess, like human level intelligence. So it's intelligence that isn't human that can basically perform tasks that human could do. Hence the kind of idea of sort of like job displacement and stuff. And then I also think another way of kind of thinking about it is, and a distinction that a lot of AI researchers make, is the distinction between narrow AI and AGI. So narrow AI is, there's already tons of examples we've seen. You might not necessarily think of them as narrow AI, but for example, like Siri and Alexa, kind of like voice detection, the recommendation algorithms that are used by YouTube. I think to some degree, I still think humans are kind of overseeing it, but in terms like content moderation on social media platforms as well. So that's just one example of how quickly it's kind of, how AI really does already play quite a big role in like how kind of, I guess, like platforms that people use to sort of deliberate and stuff on is already sort of being to some degree like monitored or like moderated by AI systems. So yeah. And then I guess in the print industry, like examples of that would be like print quality inspection, and like machine maintenance monitoring. So those very kind of like narrow tasks. And then the alternative is, or not the alternative, but the other kind of AI that people tend to talk about is like artificial general intelligence. So this is often when people talk about the kind of existential threat of AI. This is what they're talking about, because it's effectively AI that can, which by the way we don't have, and it might be a long time before there is such a thing as AGI. But it's basically, like us, it's a AI system that can perform like basically a wide range of tasks the same way that we can, and has kind of like the sort of adaptability that we have, or emotional intelligence that we have. But it's very difficult to know how that's going to play out. We know
So what you're saying there is, so the narrow AI is really focused on a specific task. It's clever. It's things like predictive maintenance. It's things like you said, print quality, inspection technology, which enables, sort of consistency and so on. And that, but that's very narrow around specific tasks. And AGI is where we're moving towards where the technology starts to think for itself, learn for itself, solve problems itself, think of new things itself. Would it even be able to do? I mean, like, because I've always felt that, if AI can do the menial tasks that humans find boring, it proved that it should release us to be creative. And that's really where the opportunity is. And I think within the print industry, we've got a problem in skills shortages and people to do the job. So it has surely a role around improving productivity. But what you're saying is one day it could actually be almost human-like.
I think it's hard. It's hard to say. I think definitely. I mean, I'm not very good at making predictions, especially for stuff like that, because I think it's so difficult to know. Like, there's so many steps. Like, there's such a diverse range of perspectives. Like, some people think AGI is, like, on the horizon, and other people think it's like not even a possibility. So it's like it's very difficult. But I mean, like, there are kind of like robots that have there's this company called, what's it called? But anyway, they've basically used, they're like a robotics company, and they've used basically Chat GPT to sort of like merge their robot with like the ability to kind of like speak. So it's kind of like a speaking robot that can also like perform tasks at the same time. And you look at that and you think, okay, like, maybe we're not that far away. But then at the same time, it's, is that how many hours of training has, gone into it just being able to do that? Like, is it really adaptable? And also all of those sort of questions. But with the print industry specifically, I think in the short term, it's going to be it will be a lot of sort of like narrow applications that will, likely sort of improve efficiency. Like, for example, like print quality control. So like AI powered systems that can monitor print quality in like real time, and like predictive maintenance. So algorithms that can kind of predict whether a machine's kind of, on its last legs or not, whatever. Or like using for example, like layouts and stuff, like using AI to basically like speed up the process of creating like marketing materials and all of that kind of stuff. And in that, potentially in that kind of like increased efficiency, like including like supply chain optimization and stuff like that. Overall, it could, I guess, kind of has the potential to kind of increase the sustainability and efficiency of the industry as a whole. But
yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's an interesting point. The productivity role is an exciting one. I think there's a lot of work going on in that field, but it's not obvious where it's being used, how it's being used. And I think, you're going to give a talk at the event, and I'm looking forward to hearing from different stories, different work that people are doing, and different opinions for it. Because frankly, if AI is able to expedite and improve productivity, then it's a bit of a no-brainer, isn't it? I mean, we should be open to its potential. On that note, then, I mean, I'm sure you're very familiar with the Gartner hype cycle, being somebody that looks and thinks and so on, and that AI is right at the peak of that at the moment. The Gartner hype cycle. I try speaking properly. Is it overhyped then, AI, or would you say it's underestimated? It's so, if clearing away all the hype and the hyperbole and the kind of whole sort of discussion and politicians, investment, everything else. I mean, at the top of the hype cycle, often what happens is it falls off the hype cycle, doesn't it? And then the things that we're all talking about happening don't happen, and then it finds a role that's perhaps useful but not quite as staggering as perhaps we first thought. So what's your view? Is it overhyped or underestimated?
I think in terms of, I mean, there's been a lot of hype since, like, like the 1970s, maybe before that. So it's not like the
Not
hype
new.
necessarily. It's not a
Yeah.
new thing.
Mm.
But at the same time, I think um, the progress that certain like forms of narrow AI have made in the uh, last like 5 years or so, I think I yeah, I don't think it's overhyped. I think the concerns around it are quite often overhyped, if that makes sense.
No, it does make sense because it's all
I-
part of the hype, isn't it?
yeah, exactly. And I also think
Paranoia.
I think a lot of the kind of hype comes from trying to predict when it's all going to happen. Some people think it's there was sort of like, I think it was a recent study saying that like AI could take 80% of jobs within like 10 years. I also know uh, quite a few people who don't think that's the case at all. But it's those kind of predictions that
Mm.
get people going. Um, but the reality is, obviously you have like economists trying to predict, how much GDP is like, GDP growth it's going to generate. Um, I don't know. I just think it's very difficult. I think it's very difficult to predict. But I do think you can look into like the real short term now. How is it kind of sort of like threatening to change relatively big industries, or showing signs of that, and say that I think the actual hype around the technology is kind of quite justified. But then, like, you also have the kind of a lot of the kind of hype and fear around like artificial general intelligence. And I think I personally think it's kind of overhyped on like kind of a few levels. I think mainly like focusing on like on the question of, is like what's realistically needed for kind of general intelligence. And like I
Mm.
I would personally argue, and I know like a fair few other people's argue as well, is that you these the sort of like LLMs like that we use and kind of produce very um sort
Sorry,
of
what
like
they? LLM.
LLM, so like ChatGPT, or
Ah,
uh
large
like
language models.
large language models. Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
um they they seem, when you sort of like uh communicate with one, it feels kind of quite human sometimes. um but
Mm.
in a sense, in a very kind of like reductionistic sense, it's kind of just like predicting
Mm.
what would kind of the best answer be, say, in this time. So for general intelligence, do you need like a physical world? Do you need self-awareness? Do you need emotional intelligence? Do you need the ability to adapt and learn, um,
Mm. Mm.
without having to have like hours and hours of training, just to perform like a very specific task?
Mm.
I think all of those things are questions kind of worth asking. And like, I think like AI consciousness as well. I think it's just in terms of, doesn't AI need to have some kind of level of consciousness to be uh to be an AGI? That's, some people kind of
You've mentioned
believe
that a
that.
couple of times.
Yeah,
AGI means artificial generative intelligence. Is that
general,
what it's
general.
general? Okay.
Yeah, so it's kind of like general intelligence.
Mm.
So the same way that we have kind of general intelligence in the sense that we can, you know, like write a paper, we can like communicate with people, we can play sports. It's a very kind of like general intelligence. And some people think um, you need some level of kind of like consciousness to be able to do that we have, that LLMs don't have. So yeah, and we don't even like know really what like the inner states of like animals, like like fishes and insects, let alone like that have very kind of like simplistic quite simplistic brains compared to humans. So I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of like uncertainty, and in many cases, it's kind of like overhyped.
Yeah, and I think
That
that's right.
field.
The uncertainty means that often it's go back to the media we're talking about. They like writing stories about what could happen, and it's clickbait, and it's not necessarily true. And like you say, it's perhaps almost on reaching sort of paranoid levels. But I think if I mean I personally have used and do use ChatGPT and DAL-E. I think it's the graphic making,
Yeah, yeah.
and it's amazing, but it doesn't really it doesn't really create graphics that you kind of think, well, that's amazing. It's not. It's great. It's useful, but it's not. A human designer will give you a far superior kind of product.
It's
But it's
interesting.
amazing. But it's a fantastic creative tool because you can play with it. You can have ideas, and it sparks other ideas. So it's almost like you're working with something
Mm.
that's helping you, on the one hand, be more productive, on the other hand, explore ideas, which you. So I think it is fantastic. I think what's led to this hype has been that platform, that freedom and accessibility we'll have to it, that we can play with what I think previously would have been the domain of perhaps software engineers or people that already know how to code or work with algorithms that are kind of like, and I think that's one of the things. And I sort of often compare the hype around AI to the hype that was around consumer 3D printing. Consumer 3D printing had that hype, massive hype in the media. Everyone was going to get one. Everybody's going to print their cutlery. We wouldn't be needing to do this. We wouldn't need to do that. It fell off its hype, top of its hype cycle. And then, of course, it's still the domain of hobbyists. It's found a niche, though. It's found a role in industrial, but it is nothing like the hype suggested it would be. What I think is different with AI personally is that we can all access it. You don't need an engineering degree to play with the technology. And it might be a rudimentary form, the ChatGPT, compared to some of the other platforms, but it's AI and it's incredibly helpful and clever. And it's a tool. That's how I see it. It's a tool. Um,
Yeah, yeah. I'm the same as I'm the same as you. Like I use it. You know, I don't use it for like links and stuff like that, where I can find like papers and stuff like that. Although there are really good uh apps like or like search engines like Perplexity and Find
mm,
that can help you find links. So, but I'm the same as you. I find it useful for kind of having like thinking through an idea. Um,
mm.
and I know some people who use it for like therapy and stuff like that. But
Oh, really? What they ask AI? I've got this problem. Give me a solution or something. I
yeah,
mean,
or
yeah,
like
and probably, yeah,
they'll
yeah.
I know of someone who kind of put all his diary entries into the language model and asked, like, can you spot any sort of like destructive patterns
Oh,
in
really? It
his
turns out.
yeah. I
Okay.
know he said he found it quite useful and that he kind of understood
Mm,
himself better for it,
that's
which is
interesting.
interesting as well. So
Mm, mm.
um yeah, but yeah,
That's
no,
the
that's interesting.
extent of how clever it is. I mean, let's be honest, it is incredibly clever. Um, yes, and I think we'll discover, around, and we kind of touched on this already, and I was kind of interested in your opinion, really. Um, in terms of it playing a positive role, in your view, will it be about improved productivity or enhanced creativity, or both, I suppose? What's your view, really?
Do you think is that in general or within the
Yeah, I think in general, but
okay?
and I think it goes to print. I mean, print's a manufacturing process, so we've already talked about productivity in a way. We've answered it because I think it has already started having a role there. But like I've kind of suggested, I use it for ideas, but will it have a role for creativity? Is that more to do with helping the human be creative, or will it end up having its own ability to create?
I think I think for I think we spoke about it the other day is like the one kind of thing people like I think will have kind of issues dealing with is when we think of maybe someone who's going to go write a book and they'd go to go to like a library, for example, we'd look at that and think, oh yeah, he's just like researching for a book. But I think at the moment people still look at, people using AI for sort of like creative endeavors, and think, oh, like he's just using AI. He's not using
You're cheating.
you're cheating. Like you're not using your own. And I think that's kind of really interesting thing to think about, because in a way it's, I guess a good kind of question to ask is, are the kind of people who are going to be, sort of maybe like intellectually productive in the future, or intellectually creative, are they going to be the people that learn how to use these models to kind of enhance their own thought? So I think that kind of I think the ability to be creative in a sense could be enhanced by that kind of using like an LLM as a kind of like giant library in a way, rather than just going down to a library and grabbing a few books. Now, whether that kind of like damages people's ability to, think through something deeply without getting an answer immediately, that's a kind of interesting kind of conundrum. But other than that, I guess in a kind of very, I don't know whether you'd call it like creativity or productivity, probably like a balance of a few. But I think there's a few kind of fields, for example, like healthcare, for example, where there are kind of AI systems already sort of combining new combinations of drugs and stuff like that, creating new developing drugs. In fact,
That's an interesting one, healthcare,
yeah,
because you're talking about the predictive maintenance of machines. I mean, is there an application for AI for, predicting health, gauging health, foreseeing issues? I guess.
yeah. Well, it's been quite, like, in some cases it's been quite revolutionary in research. For example, Google DeepMind's AlphaFold predicted, I think it basically predicted the kind of like the structure of like 20,000 proteins. So like the proteome, which is like the equivalent of the genome, but for proteins. It basically managed to predict like the structure of 20,000, which is basically like the entire most like the entire proteome, whereas only 17% was kind of known about before this. So it would have taken, maybe hundreds of years to actually make this breakthrough. But because it's very good at the kind of like domain specific task of being able to kind of like sort of like pattern recognition, I suppose, they were able to kind of like advance a field, which is really important. Like knowing the structure of like certain proteins is really important for like drug discovery. Obviously, because you can design new drugs based on the information you have. So yeah, there's that, and then I think
that's very interesting. Very interesting. Sorry, I'm just thinking it back to print.
Yeah.
One of the challenges, which in terms of human significance compared to health, it doesn't have, but for the print industry, it is significant, particularly for inkjet, is flexible packaging is just incredibly challenging in terms of ink formulation, for jetting inkjet onto specific materials. And if you see a role for AI in helping chemistry, that could be pretty amazing. So it's not about replacing, it's about enhancing the speed to which solutions can be found to increase the role of inkjet within the printing industry, specifically in packaging, because that's obviously the packaging industry is gargantuan, yet its uptake in terms of certain technologies is quite slow. Some of that is due to technical stuff, and one of those is specific formulation and application challenges. It's not entirely all technical. Sometimes it's cultural, sometimes it's other economics, but particularly on the technical level. But anyway, sorry, I just was listening to you and thinking, oh yeah, but I would imagine work's already been done in that field in any case, but you can see how it could help solve some of the big problems. But like you said, going back to what you're saying, a very narrow that's where it seems to have a sweet spot, when it's very narrow, specific tasks, specific roles or problem that it's there to help solve. Um, and I think therefore we shouldn't be worried about it, should we? It should be a tool that we exploit and use and learn about. I think that's the main thing, learning about it. I know you said you're
Yeah,
not.
I think
Yeah.
it depends, because you can also use, like, going back to the sort of macro level, you can also use very like domain specific ways of like very narrow forms of AI to, the same way that you
Mm,
can find new drug developments, you can also
mm,
potentially engineer like lethal pathogens quicker, and stuff like that. So
mm.
so going back to
Same thing happened with 3D printing though,
okay.
in terms of the negative impact. It was like, oh yeah, but you could print anything. Oh, you can print guns, and lo and behold,
Ah, okay.
somebody did print a gun, 3D print a gun, and somebody did shoot the 3D printed gun. And
Yeah.
so like you're saying, there's always a demonic, you know, flip side to something new. But
Yeah.
it's a human frailty, that, isn't it? There are going to be people that are on the dark side, so to speak. And I think it has that sense to it. It's like, oh, there's a dark side to this. Well, there isn't. Humans are the ones that are responsible. The AI is not just deciding anything. It's a human behind it, isn't there? Any other thoughts, or sort of any questions, or so on, that you might sort of like to leave us with? I know you said you don't like predicting the future, but I can predict that on April 16th, rather, you will be speaking in Cambridge at AI for Print conference. Any sort of thoughts and things you might want to leave us with ahead of that, and also just leave us with how people can view Knowledge Brief and what Knowledge Brief is, and a bit more about that, just to leave people with. Hmm.
Yeah, sure. So my channels, I mainly use YouTube at the moment, but if I've also create like scripts from the videos on Substack with all of the linked references to everything,
Hmm.
every article, anything I've used. So yeah, to kind of like improve that, kind of like credibility aspect. Anything to leave you with? I think one kind of interesting thing to discuss in terms of like for like for industry in general is, what kind of role will automation have on I guess like jobs and
Yeah.
workers. In fact, there's actually one other thing I could say as well, which is kind of like a misconception, but with digital automation, I think we saw kind of we did see an increase in productivity. But since like the 70s, there's been a kind of growth and inequality in industrialized nations, and like specifically in the US, there's been sort of a widening gap between people who have like uh, college degrees and high school graduates. And that hasn't always been the case. Like after World War II, the kind of prosperity of like automation was kind of shared quite
Mm.
widely. So I think that's a kind of one thing that's very important for industries, is working out ways in which technologies like AI can sort of enhance the jobs that the humans are doing in a way, rather than just like replacing them for very little kind of like marginal return. So like, for example, um uh like having a piece of AI software that can help someone do like a job quicker, rather than like, a classic example of like uh a supermarket where they've just using like a self-scan checkout versus like using a person. Does that actually make like the company or whatever more productive, or is it just kind of like replacing humans for the sake of it so that it can
Mm.
kind of increase its profit? So I think that's kind of one interesting thing to follow. And also I think there's been a lot of hype recently about I think this is kind of one kind of example of that kind of hype we were talking about, is the sort of environmental effects that AI is having on the planet. But I think in reality, if you like look at the numbers, if you go to the IEA, it's actually only, I think, something like the energy use from data centers. It's only like something like 0.6% of like total greenhouse gas emissions. And if you put that in the context of like 25, the fact that like 25% of total global greenhouse gas emissions comes from electricity, it's actually a tiny fraction. So that was just one more thing I wanted to say, because I feel like recently there's been a lot of hype saying like, oh, these AI companies are awful for the environment. But if you compare it to other industries, and it's really not. I don't think it's as bad as people think. But some people might disagree with me. But
no, but I'm sure in the field of sustainability innovation, AI is being used a lot to improve productivity, and that
exactly,
goes
yeah,
hand in hand and with reducing energy use and creating too much carbon. So yeah, listen, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a really interesting conversation. I'm looking forward to seeing you again in Cambridge, giving a talk around AI, what it means for sort of on a macro level, as well as sort of touching on print. So yeah, check out Knowledge Brief on YouTube. Like you say, you've got Substack as well, and some really good content, one that you put out recently about the impact of AI on democracy. So yeah, looking forward to seeing you in Cambridge, and thanks for joining us, Finn.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe now for more great audio content coming up. And visit futureprint.tech for the latest news, partner interviews, in-depth industry research, and to catch up on content from Futureprint events. We'll see you next time on the Futureprint podcast.